Welcome to Unit 1.7a, Finding the Greatest Common Factor, GCF, and the Least Common Multiple, LCM. So before we get started, when we talk about the greatest common factor, we are looking for numbers that are divisible by the numbers. So when we think about being divisible, the GCF should always be less or equal to the original value. And when we talk about the least common multiple, since multiples are always, multiples of a number, the LCM should always be greater or equal to the original value. So keeping that in mind, when we look at example 1, the ladder method for GCF and LCM, we're going to try to find the LCM and the GCF of 8 and 10. Now the ladder method is going to consist of setting up your two numbers and basically setting up a ladder. So when we look at the 8 and 10, what we're looking for is some number that we can divide both 8 and 10 by. So think of those common ones. If it's an even number, we can always divide by 2, which would leave us with 4 and 5. Now when we look at 4 and 5, is there anything we can divide by? Well, in this situation there is not. So where this is going to, leave us is since we are dividing by our common factors, whatever we can bring out is going to be our GCF. So in this case, the GCF is that 2. If you're going to look at the least common multiple, the least common multiple is going to be taking all of your numbers on the outside and then multiplying them to find your least common multiple. So when you look at the LCM, that's going to be a 2 times 4 times 5. So what's 8 times 5? And our least common multiple is going to be a 40. So we can apply that method as a kind of a shortcut. Some of you may be looking at those numbers and realize the greatest common factor that you can divide by is 2 from the start. Or some of you may just know your multiples well enough to look at 8 and 10 and say, well, okay, if I just do 10, 20, 30, 40, that's the first one, 8 as well. But if you do not have, you don't see those numbers come to you right away, this ladder method will work. So let's look at a few more of this ladder method. So if we're looking for the GCF and the LCM of 15 and 30, let's start by putting them in our ladder. And let's look for factors. So if we're looking at 15 and 30, then maybe the first factor that comes to mind is these are both divisible by 5. So 15 divided by 5 is 3. 30 divided by 5 is 6. And if we're looking at 3 and 6, they have a common factor. So if we can divide by 3, 3 divided by 3 is 1. 6 divided by 3 is 2. Once we get to this point of our ladder, 1 and 2, we're kind of stopped. So once again, these numbers on the outside are going to be your GCF. So 5 times 3, that is going to be 15 for our GCF. And if we look for LCM, we are now going to take all of these. So when we look at that as our LCM, that's going to be 5 times 3 times 1 times 2. So 5 times 3 is 15. Anything times 1 is itself. So it's 15 times 2. Our LCM, our least common multiple, is 30. Now, just looking back, if you started with 15 and 30 and saw that they were both divisible by 15, well, that just kind of gets us to our GCF a little bit nicer, a little bit quicker, and then if we do our LCM, again, would still end up being the whole outside. So it does get us to the same answer, just maybe a little quicker. So if we look at 12 and 16, the first number, we're trying to divide by is jumping out is maybe a 4. So if you take that 12 divided by 4 and 16 divided by 4, you can see here we can kind of jump right into that GCF a little bit quicker. There's nothing else to divide, so we know that that is going to be a 4. And if we look at our LCM, that's going to take all of them. So what is a 4 times 4 times 3? And calculate that up and get a 48. If you didn't see the 4 from the start, We can do 2 and 2. But again, we're going to end up with that 2 times 2 is 4 is your GCF. And if we did the 4 times 3 times 4, again, gives you that 48. So either way, gets us to the answer. It's just all in what you see. I'm going to bring up the fourth example, 20 and 20. Because if we're looking at the GCF and LCM of essentially the same number, well, the biggest number that's going to be divisible is going to be a 20, leaving us with 1 and 1. So if you look at this answer, this is going to be a unique case where the GCF is still 20 because they're both the same number. And if we look at our least common multiple, the lowest number that they both multiply to be would also be 20, because 20 times 1 times 1 is 20. So I just wanted to take a look at that one last unique case before we start our practice. Okay, take a few minutes to practice 1.7a before we move on and check our work. Good luck.